The city was alive in every sense. Lights flashing, cars honking, and people moving like a well-oiled machine. The hum of modern life surrounded Sarah Chen as she stepped out of the rideshare, her heels clicking on the pavement. At 24, she had it all: followers, influence, and a carefully curated brand. The apartment building ahead stood tall, its glass and steel exterior gleaming under the streetlights. It was more than just a place to stay, it was the perfect backdrop for her next live stream, the one that would elevate her brand even higher. As she walked through the sleek entrance, her heart beat a little faster. This was her domain, where she created, performed, and thrived. Every corner of the space was designed to look perfect. But something was off. The air felt heavy, as if the apartment itself was watching her, anticipating the performance. She shook off the feeling. After all, it was just her mind playing tricks, right? She set up her equipment with precision, as she always did. Her phone, camera, and lights were adjusted to perfection. The stream would start soon, and her followers would be waiting. Sarah gave a practiced smile to the lens. She would make this night unforgettable. Little did she know, tonight's live stream wasn't just for her followers, it was for something far more sinister. The live stream began at precisely 8:37 p.m., the perfect time for maximum engagement. Sarah smiled brightly into the camera, greeting her audience with a cheerful, "Hey everyone, welcome to my latest urban adventure." She panned the camera across the apartment, showcasing its pristine beauty, the artwork, the minimalist furniture, and the incredible view. Her followers flooded the chat with emojis and comments, praising the space and sending virtual applause. But then, the unexpected happened. The camera shifted. Sarah's hands remained perfectly still, yet the lens moved on its own. At first it was subtle, just a slight shift in angle as if someone was adjusting it from a distance, but soon the movements became more pronounced. The camera zoomed in on areas she hadn't intended to show. The dark corners of the room, the cracks in the walls. "Who's controlling the camera?" A comment popped up. "Look behind you." Her smile faltered. Panic crept into her voice as she tried to regain control of the situation, but no matter how she adjusted the camera, it continued to move. Something, or someone else, was in control. The chat exploded with frantic comments, urging her to turn around, warning her that something was wrong. She wasn't just the performer anymore. Now she was the subject. As the live stream continued, Sarah's professional composure began to crack. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Every adjustment she made seemed futile. The camera kept shifting, revealing spaces that shouldn't have existed. There were angles, impossible corners, and shadows that moved with intention. It was like the apartment had taken on a life of its own. When the live stream ended, Sarah was left shaken, her hands trembling as she stared at the still image on her screen. But her followers weren't done. They began to analyze every frame, every second of the stream. What they found was even more unsettling. The digital forensics revealed distortions in the footage, small anomalies in the shadows, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Some viewers even claimed to see a face staring back at them from the camera's lens, though Sarah hadn't noticed it at the time. The deeper they dug, the more the stream seemed to unravel. The apartment, the carefully crafted background, everything began to feel wrong. Sarah wasn't just performing for her followers, she was becoming a part of something far darker, something that was feeding on her, altering her in ways she couldn't understand, and her followers were too invested to stop. Midnight arrived and the stream was still active. Sarah, exhausted and terrified, stared at the screen. The camera no longer obeyed her commands. It moved on its own, capturing every corner of the apartment, every shadow. She had lost control. The chat was now a flurry of urgent messages. "Sarah, it's not you anymore. Turn off the stream now." But it was too late. The camera revealed more than just the apartment. It showed impossible spaces, rooms that didn't exist in the layout, narrow hallways where there were none, and in those spaces, figures moved. Shadows, so subtle at first, became more defined as the camera zoomed in on them. They were watching her. The stream never stopped. It felt like time had distorted, like the walls were closing in on her. Sarah had become a part of the story, a story she no longer controlled. Her followers, now part of a collective nightmare, were witnessing it unfold in real time. And then, as if nothing had ever happened, the camera went black. The stream ended. Sarah was gone. The apartment was empty. The viewers were left with nothing but the chilling silence of their screens. But as the lights flickered off in the apartment, a new live stream began elsewhere. It was a different room, a different city, but the camera was already moving on its own. The story was far from over. Who would be the next subject? Before we move on to our next story, take a moment to check your surroundings. Are you watching this alone? Maybe now's a good time to turn on an extra light. And if you're finding these true stories as terrifying as they are fascinating, hit that like button. It helps other viewers find these potentially life-saving warnings. David and Emily Matthews pulled into the driveway of the charming Victorian rental, its crisp white facade gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The house looked like a painting, perfectly symmetrical, hedges trimmed with surgical precision, and not a single flaw in its appearance. It was the ideal escape for the couple, who had meticulously planned this weekend to unwind from their demanding corporate jobs. As they stepped out of their car, Emily, ever the planner, clutched her clipboard, ready to check off items on her itinerary. David followed, carrying their neatly packed bags with the precision of a man accustomed to control. They admired the house for a moment before stepping inside. The interior was no less perfect. Antique furniture arranged with care, walls adorned with black and white photographs, and surfaces polished to a mirror shine. But as they explored, a subtle unease crept in. The air felt thick, almost alive, and the silence was oppressive. In the center of the living room stood a coffee table, and on it a leather-bound guest book. Its edges were worn, yet it appeared well preserved, as if it had been waiting for them. Emily picked it up, intrigued. "Looks like a guest book," she said, flipping through its pages. David joined her, and together they read the first few entries, generic compliments about the house and its amenities. But as they turned more pages, the writing seemed to shift, both in style and tone. "Strange," Emily muttered, but they dismissed it for now, unaware that they had already crossed a line they couldn't uncross. The guest book's early entries seemed ordinary enough. Visitors praised the house's charm, its peaceful ambiance, and the warmth of its design. But as David and Emily read on, the comments began to take an unsettling turn. One entry from decades ago read, "A beautiful home, but the mirrors feel wrong." Another, written in a shaky hand, stated, "Can't sleep. Something keeps whispering." Emily frowned. "These dates don't make sense," she said. Some entries were decades apart, but written in eerily similar handwriting. David, ever the analyst, leaned closer. "It's almost like the same person wrote these, but over 100 years?" The further they read, the more disturbing the entries became. One visitor had written, "Don't stay past midnight. That's when it chooses." Another scribbled in frantic strokes, "The walls know. They see everything." The last few pages were blank, save for faint indentations on the paper, as though someone had written but the ink had vanished. Emily traced the marks with her fingers, her unease growing. The house, which had seemed inviting earlier, now felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the walls made her flinch. "We should stop reading this," David said finally, shutting the book. But even as he did, the air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the room deepened. Unseen eyes seemed to be watching their every move. As night fell, the house's perfection felt like a facade. The silence was too perfect, the stillness unnatural. David and Emily sat on the couch, the guest book now closed, but its presence heavy in the room. Every now and then, Emily glanced at it, the faint indentations she had traced earlier haunting her thoughts. "It's just a book," David reassured her, though his voice lacked conviction. The clock struck midnight. and the house seemed to shift. A faint creak came from the hallway, followed by the sound of whispers, low and unintelligible. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, clutching David's arm. He nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The whispers grew louder, echoing as if coming from the walls themselves. Then the guest book snapped open on its own, its pages flipping wildly before settling on a blank one. Words began to appear, written by an invisible hand. "Welcome, David and Emily Matthews," the page read in elegant script. "Your stay has been noted." Emily screamed, backing away, but David couldn't move, his eyes glued to the book. The whispers grew deafening, and the shadows in the room seemed to crawl closer. The photographs on the walls began to shift, the faces in them turning to watch the couple with hollow eyes. "We need to leave," Emily whispered, pulling at David's arm. But the house had other plans. The front door wouldn't budge no matter how hard they pulled. Windows that had opened effortlessly earlier were now sealed shut. The house had them. The guest book lay open on the coffee table, its blank pages filling with more words. Every guest leaves their mark, it read. Every mark becomes part of the whole. David and Emily huddled together as the room seemed to close in around them. The shadows now had form. Tall, faceless figures that moved with deliberate slowness. The whispers became a chant, repeating their names over and over. David grabbed the book, intending to destroy it, but the leather burned his hands, forcing him to drop it. The house seemed to laugh, the sound resonating through the walls. The last thing they saw before the lights went out was the guest book. Its final words read, "They all stay. You will too." When morning came, the house stood as pristine as ever, its facade hiding the horrors within. The guest book lay on the table, open to a blank page, waiting for its next visitors. Samantha and Jared had been planning their getaway for weeks. The Airbnb listing looked too good to pass up, a sprawling estate in East Texas, rich with history and charm. The pictures showed towering oak trees, an elaborate fountain in the front yard, and a grand staircase leading to the main entrance. Samantha, a history enthusiast, was particularly excited about its backstory. The estate had belonged to an oil tycoon from the early 1900s, a man named Leonard Blackwell, known for his ruthless business tactics and mysterious disappearance. The couple arrived late in the afternoon. The estate was as impressive as the pictures promised, with its vintage furnishings and high ceilings. Samantha admired the antique decor, especially the dining room centerpiece, a large portrait of Leonard Blackwell himself. He was depicted standing next to an oil rig dressed in a... Jarrett made a joke about the eyes following them as they moved around the room, but Samantha dismissed it, attributing it to the eerie realism of old oil paintings. As night fell, the estate took on a different energy. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and the wind howled through the cracks of the old windows. Jarrett suggested they open a bottle of wine to ease the tension. Samantha agreed, but couldn't shake the feeling that Leonard's painted eyes were fixed on her, as if silently observing every move. The couple settled into their bedroom, a lavish space with a canopy bed and velvet drapes. Exhausted from their drive, Jared fell asleep quickly, but Samantha lay awake, unsettled by the creaks and groans of the old house. Around midnight, a faint dripping sound broke the silence. Samantha assumed it was the bathroom faucet and decided to check. The ensuite bathroom was completely dry. The sound, however, persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Curious and slightly unnerved, she followed it downstairs. The house felt colder with each step, the air thick and oppressive. In the dining room, the dripping sound became a steady trickle. Samantha froze when she saw the source, dark, viscous liquid oozing from the frame of Leonard Blackwell's portrait. The once pristine oil painting now seemed alive, the black liquid resembling crude oil pooling on the floor. The eyes in the portrait were no longer stern and watchful, but solid black voids. Terrified, Samantha bolted upstairs to wake Jared, but when she reached their room, he wasn't in bed. She found him by the window, staring out into the pitch-black yard. His voice was distant and monotone as he muttered, "He's watching us. He doesn't want us here." When she entered, the room was empty, but the oil had spread, forming a trail leading out the back door. Samantha followed it, trembling. The trail ended at an overgrown path that led to an old oil well. She could see muddy footprints near the edge of the well, Jared's sneakers unmistakable among them. She screamed his name, but the only response was the hollow echo of her voice. Suddenly, the wind picked up, carrying a faint, guttural whisper. "Mine." Desperate to leave, Samantha tried to shake Jared from his trance, but he remained unresponsive, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the house, coming from the front door. Samantha froze, her heart pounding. Who would visit at this hour? Summoning her courage, she crept downstairs. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. The fountain outside was eerily still, and the oak trees loomed like silent sentinels. Samantha locked the door and turned to head back upstairs, but stopped in her tracks when she heard Jared's voice coming from the dining room. The next morning, Samantha called the police. Search teams scoured the property but found no trace of Jared. The portrait of Leonard Blackwell was gone, leaving an empty frame on the dining room wall. The police dismissed Samantha's story as stress-induced hysteria, but she knew the truth. Weeks later, she received a message from the Airbnb host, apologizing for the incident and offering a refund. The host mentioned in passing that the estate had a history of peculiar happenings, but assured her that no other guests had reported anything serious. Samantha couldn't bring herself to reply. Haunted by Jared's disappearance, she returned to the estate one last time, determined to find answers. The oil well had been sealed off, a makeshift memorial placed nearby. It was then that Samantha noticed something chilling. A new portrait hung in the dining room. It depicted Leonard Blackwell, now accompanied by a man who looked eerily like Jared, standing next to him with the same dark, hollow eyes. Ben and his sister Claire had always loved road trips, and this time they decided to escape the chaos of city life by booking a remote Airbnb ranch in West Texas. The listing promised a serene retreat, miles away from the nearest neighbor, with a rustic charm that felt like stepping back in time. When they arrived, the ranch was exactly as described. Rolling fields stretched endlessly, and the centerpiece of the property was an ancient windmill, its rusted blades creaking softly in the breeze. A handwritten note from the host sat on the kitchen table, welcoming them and offering a peculiar warning. "The windmill is historic. Please don't go near it after sunset." The siblings chuckled at the cryptic advice, assuming it was meant to preserve the fragile structure or add an air of mystery to the place. They spent the afternoon exploring the ranch and taking pictures of the scenic surroundings. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. The wind stilled, yet the windmill blades began to spin on their own, faster and faster. The rhythmic creaking grew louder, echoing through the empty fields. Claire, always the curious one, decided to take a closer look despite Ben's protests. "Come on, it's probably just the wind," she said, grabbing a flashlight. Reluctantly, Ben followed, a sinking feeling in his stomach as they approached the towering structure. The windmill loomed over them, its blades spinning unnaturally fast despite the stillness of the air. As they drew closer, Claire noticed something strange. Faint whispers seemed to emanate from the structure, carried on an invisible breeze. At first she thought it was the wind whistling through the metal, but the whispers became clearer, more distinct. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Ben nodded, gripping her arm. The whispers weren't just noise, they were words, their names being repeated over and over. "Claire, Ben, Claire, Ben." The sound was soft yet unnervingly deliberate, as if someone or something was calling to them. Claire's flashlight flickered as she stepped closer, reaching out to touch the rusted metal. The moment her fingers grazed the surface, the whispers stopped, replaced by an ear-piercing scream that seemed to erupt from the windmill itself. Claire stumbled backward, clutching her ears. "What the hell was that?" Ben shouted, pulling her away. The windmill's blades slowed to a halt, and the siblings stood in stunned silence. Claire was visibly shaken, but insisted she was fine. They hurried back to the house, locking the doors behind them. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the whispers, now coming from outside the window. When she peered into the darkness, she swore she saw a shadowy figure standing near the windmill, watching the house. The next morning, Ben insisted they leave, but Claire seemed different. She was distant, her usual lively demeanor replaced with a blank stare and quiet murmurs. She dismissed his concerns, claiming she was just tired. As they packed their bags, Claire kept glancing toward the windmill. When Ben went outside to load the car, he heard her whispering something under her breath. He froze when he realized she was speaking in a language he didn't recognize. "Claire, what's going on?" he demanded, but she didn't respond. Instead, she walked out of the house and headed straight for the windmill, her movements mechanical and unnervingly calm. Ben chased after her, yelling for her to stop, but she didn't even glance back. The windmill's blades had begun to spin again, faster than ever, though there wasn't a breath of wind. Claire reached the base of the structure and placed her hand on the rusted metal. "Claire!" Ben screamed, but it was too late. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the ground beneath the windmill began to shake. Claire turned to him, her eyes glazed over, and said in a chilling monotone, "It's calling me. I have to stay." Ben grabbed Claire's arm, desperate to pull her away, but she resisted with an unnatural strength. The windmill's blades spun so fast they became a blur, and the whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Claire, please, let's go," Ben pleaded, tears streaming down his face. She smiled faintly, a sad, almost apologetic expression, and whispered, "It's not your time." Before Ben could react, she stepped backward into the shadow of the windmill and disappeared. The blades stopped instantly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Ben searched for her all night, calling her name and circling the property, but she was gone. The next morning, he contacted the authorities, but the host claimed no responsibility, saying the windmill was part of the ranch's history and had always been peculiar. Weeks later, Ben received an email from the Airbnb host informing him that the listing had been removed. Attached to the email was a photograph taken decades earlier. It showed a group of people standing near the windmill. Miners, ranchers, and what appeared to be a young woman who looked exactly like Claire.